A young girl steps into the chaos of a bustling New York City street, shouting words that bring the world to a standstill. "My mom said you're my dad." The crowd freezes, cameras flash, and a confident millionaire halts in his tracks. But as the echoes of her accusation ripple through the city, this isn't just a moment of shock. It's the beginning of an unraveling. Behind her defiant eyes lies a story of love, betrayal, and survival, while behind his steely exterior hides a past he thought he'd buried forever. As the media frenzy explodes, secrets from a forgotten romance start to surface, threatening to destroy his empire and shatter her fragile world. What happens when the truth refuses to stay hidden? Can a family torn apart by ambition and deception find redemption? Or is it already too late? When life collides with legacy, the stakes aren't just personal, they're monumental. How far would you go to uncover the truth? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn breeze whipped through the concrete canyons of New York City, sending yellow leaves dancing across the sidewalk. Ethan Caldwell emerged from his gleaming black Mercedes, his polished Oxford shoes touching the pavement with practiced precision. The crisp air carried the familiar scents of the city: coffee from the corner cafe, exhaust from the endless stream of taxis, and the slight metallic tang that seemed unique to Manhattan. A street vendor's cart nearby added the warm aroma of roasted nuts to the mix. He straightened his navy silk tie, a habit more than a necessity. The weight of his tailored suit settled comfortably on his shoulders as he prepared for another day of board meetings and million-dollar decisions. At 42, Ethan had mastered the art of commanding attention without seeking it. His presence alone turned heads, the perfect picture of success. His carefully styled salt and pepper hair and confident stride completed the image of a man who had everything under control. "My mom said you're my dad." The words sliced through the usual city cacophony like a thunderclap. Ethan's hand froze mid-motion, his fingers still gripping his tie. Through the sea of suits and shopping bags, a small figure pushed forward. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans with patches at the knees and a faded red sweater that had seen better days. A worn backpack hung from one shoulder, covered in hand-drawn doodles and peace signs. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, determined, fierce, and oddly familiar. They held the same warm chocolate-brown shade that had haunted his dreams for years. The girl, Sophie, stood her ground as the crowd parted around her like water around a stone. "Did you hear me?" she demanded, her voice stronger now. Her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "I said you're my father." The words seemed to echo off the glass and steel buildings. Smartphones appeared like magic in dozens of hands, their cameras pointed directly at this unfolding drama. Ethan felt his carefully constructed world tilting sideways. His throat went dry as passing pedestrians slowed their pace, drawn to the spectacle like moths to a flame. "Mr. Caldwell!" A reporter materialized from nowhere, microphone thrust forward like a weapon, her red blazer a bright spot in the sea of business suits. "Do you have any comment on this accusation?" Another voice. "Is this a secret love child? How long have you known about her?" Camera flashes exploded around them, creating a strobe light effect that made the scene feel surreal. Ethan's security team moved with practiced efficiency, forming a barrier between him and the growing crowd. But Sophie's voice carried over the chaos, clear and unwavering. "Mom's name is Maria. You remember her, don't you? Or did you forget her just like you forgot about us?" Her words carried a weight beyond her years, each one striking like a hammer against the walls he'd built around his past. Ethan's face remained impassive, but his mind raced. Maria, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. His throat tightened as memories threatened to surface. Memories of summer nights, promises made, and promises broken. "Get her out of here," he ordered through clenched teeth, watching as his security team gently but firmly moved Sophie back toward the sidewalk. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuffs, a nervous tic he thought he'd overcome years ago. "You can't ignore me forever," Sophie shouted as she was guided away, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'm not going anywhere." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the emotion behind her brave facade. Ethan turned sharply, striding toward the building's entrance. His shoes clicked against the marble floor of the lobby, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. Behind him, through the glass doors, he could still hear the commotion. Reporters shouting questions, phones ringing, the general buzz of excitement that followed scandal. The morning doorman avoided his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting his uniform. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, offering escape. Inside, Ethan jabbed the button for the 42nd floor. His assistant, Linda, slipped in just before the doors closed, her tablet clutched to her chest, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "Sir," she began cautiously, her fingers nervously tapping against the tablet screen, "the press is already running with the story. It's trending on social media." Ethan's jaw clenched. The girl's eyes haunted him. They were so like Maria's, filled with that same fierce determination he'd once known. He loosened his tie, suddenly feeling suffocated. The elevator's soft hum seemed deafening in the tense silence. "Find out who that girl is," he muttered, his voice tight with barely controlled anger and something else, fear perhaps. "And stop this nonsense immediately." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. As the elevator ascended, leaving the chaos below, he could still see Sophie being escorted away, her small figure standing proud despite the surrounding mayhem. Her face showed no defeat, only resolution, as reporters swarmed around her like hungry wolves. The morning sun caught her hair, creating a halo effect that made her look achingly young and vulnerable, despite her brave stance. Sophie trudged up the creaky stairs of the shelter, her footsteps heavy from the day's confrontation. The building's walls were stained with age and neglect, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast strange, dancing shadows in the narrow hallway. She pulled her thin, worn sweater tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the persistent chill that seemed to seep through the walls like an unwelcome ghost. Room 412 was barely big enough for 2 beds and a small table with a wobbly leg, but it had been home for the past 8 months. Sophie pushed open the door carefully, wincing at the familiar squeak of rusty hinges that echoed through the quiet corridor. The musty smell of old carpet mixed with the sharp scent of medicine and disinfectant greeted her like an old friend. "Mom?" she called softly, moving through the dim space, navigating around the few belongings they'd managed to keep. "Are you awake?" Maria lay propped against 2 flat pillows, her once vibrant face now gaunt and pale beneath the harsh overhead light. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, fell limply around her shoulders like a faded curtain. At Sophie's voice, she opened her eyes, managing a weak smile that did little to hide her bone-deep exhaustion. "Help me sit up, sweetheart," Maria whispered, her voice rough from coughing, each word seeming to cost her energy she couldn't spare. Sophie rushed to her mother's side, gently supporting her back as she adjusted the pillows, trying to make her as comfortable as possible. The springs of the old mattress creaked under their movement, a sound as familiar as breathing. Through the thin walls they could hear their neighbors arguing about money again, the sound a constant backdrop to their lives in the shelter. Maria studied her daughter's face intently, her eyes still sharp despite her illness, noting the fierce determination that burned in her eyes. "You found him, didn't you?" The words came out between shallow breaths, hope and fear mingling in her voice. Sophie nodded, perching on the edge of the bed. The ancient frame groaned under her slight weight, protesting even this small disturbance. "I did, Mom. Just like you said. He works in that big glass building downtown, the one that seems to touch the clouds." Maria's eyes drifted to the window, where a slice of city skyline was visible through the crack in the dirty glass, the setting sun painting the buildings in shades of gold and purple. "Ethan always wanted the biggest and the best," she murmured, lost in memories. "Nothing else was good enough for him, huh? Not even us." Sophie listened as her mother spoke of the past, stories she'd heard countless times before, but never tired of hearing. How Ethan had been different when they first met, younger, kinder, full of dreams that didn't revolve around money and status. How his father's influence and the promise of wealth had changed him, turning his heart from love to ambition. How he'd chosen his career over their small family, leaving Maria alone and pregnant, with nothing but broken promises and fading memories. "He didn't even know about you," Maria said softly, her hand reaching for Sophie's, fingers trembling with the effort. "I tried to tell him, but by then—" Another coughing fit interrupted her words, harsh and rattling. Sophie squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath paper-thin skin. She thought about the countless hours she'd spent in the public library, using their ancient computers to search for information about Ethan Caldwell. She'd meticulously pieced together his story from news articles and business magazines, learning his schedule from social media posts about charity events and board meetings. Each detail had been another piece in the puzzle she was determined to solve. The local kids had laughed when she'd told them her father was a millionaire, their mockery echoing in the concrete playground. "If he's so rich, why you living here?" they'd taunted, their words sharp as knives. But Sophie had ignored them, laser-focused on her mission. She'd dodged the neighborhood bullies and worked long hours at the corner store, saving every precious penny for bus fare to reach his office. "I showed him today," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest like a gathering storm. "Right in front of his fancy building, with all his important people watching. He can't pretend we don't exist anymore." Maria's eyes widened with concern, the mother's instinct to protect still strong despite her weakness. "Oh, Sophie!" She reached up to touch her daughter's cheek, her hand trembling but determined. "What did he say?" "He didn't say anything," Sophie admitted, remembering how Ethan had looked right through her as if she were made of glass. "But he heard me. Everyone heard me. And tomorrow, I'll make sure he hears me again." The room grew quieter as the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows through the cracked window pane. Maria's breathing became more even as exhaustion took over, each breath a little victory. Sophie helped her lie back down, tucking the thin blanket around her shoulders with tender care. As her mother drifted off to sleep, Sophie moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She pulled out an old photograph from her pocket. Her mother at 20, beautiful and full of life. Her smile bright and hopeful, untouched by the hardships to come. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance like fallen stars, and Sophie's voice was barely a whisper as she said, "I'll make him see us. He has to. We've come too far to give up now." Ethan Caldwell's office on the 42nd floor felt like a fortress under siege. Floor-to-ceiling windows usually offered a commanding view of New York City, but today they made him feel exposed, vulnerable to the countless eyes that might be watching from neighboring skyscrapers. He sat behind his mahogany desk, his perfectly pressed charcoal suit doing little to ease his discomfort as he scrolled through the morning's headlines on his tablet, each one more sensational than the last. "Millionaire confronted by alleged daughter," he read aloud, his voice tight with tension. The words seemed to mock him from the screen. "This is absurd." Natalie Green, his PR advisor of 7 years, stood before his desk in a crisp navy suit, her expression grave and her normally confident posture betraying her concern. "Social media is having a field day with this, Ethan. The video has gone viral. We need to address it immediately." "Address what?" Ethan snapped, tossing the tablet onto his desk with enough force to make his fountain pen roll. "Some random girl making ridiculous claims?" "A girl whose story is resonating with people," Natalie corrected, her tone measured but firm. "The public loves an underdog, and right now, you're coming across as what?" His eyes narrowed, daring her to finish the thought. "As exactly what they expect. A wealthy businessman dismissing a child in need." The legal team filed into the office like a somber procession, their expressions serious beneath fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed too harsh. James Morton, his head attorney, spread several documents across the desk, their crisp pages rustling in the tense silence. "This is a clear attempt at extortion," Ethan insisted, running a hand through his perfectly groomed salt and pepper hair. "I barely knew her mother. It was nothing. A brief relationship years ago, barely worth remembering." "So you do remember Maria?" Natalie asked sharply, her eyebrows rising. Ethan's jaw tightened until he could feel his teeth grinding. "It was different times. I was focused on building my company. She understood that." "Did she?" James interjected, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a nervous gesture. "Because right now, her daughter is painting a very different picture." Ethan's phone buzzed again, another journalist seeking comment. He ignored it, just as he'd ignored the dozen calls from his sister asking if it was true, if he'd really kept such a massive secret all these years. "Issue a statement," he ordered, standing to pace behind his desk like a caged animal. "Make it clear that these allegations are completely unfounded." "Ethan," Natalie warned, stepping forward, "a flat denial could backfire. We should investigate first. Handle this privately." "There's nothing to investigate." His fist came down on the desk, making his water glass rattle against the coaster. "I'm not playing into this circus. She wants money. They always want money." On the television mounted on his office wall, a perfectly coiffed news anchor discussed the morning's confrontation with barely concealed enthusiasm. The footage played again. Sophie standing her ground in the plaza below, her voice clear and unwavering, despite the chaos around her. Something in her eyes made Ethan's stomach twist, a familiar determination he refused to acknowledge, but he pushed the feeling aside. "The board is concerned," James added quietly, his words falling heavy in the room. "They're worried about investor confidence." Ethan loosened his silk tie slightly, feeling the pressure mounting from all sides. His carefully constructed world was showing cracks, and he couldn't stand it. He moved to the window, looking down at the street where it had all happened just hours ago, now crawling with reporters hoping for a follow-up story. "This will blow over," he muttered, more to himself than the others, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. He turned back to his desk, picking up the newspaper with its glaring headline, "Scandal Brewing, Millionaire's Secret Daughter." His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with yet another unfamiliar number, and again he let it ring, the sound echoing through the increasingly suffocating office. The shelter's small room felt even more oppressive than usual that evening. A single bulb cast harsh shadows across the peeling wallpaper as Sophie sat on a rickety chair beside her mother's bed. The musty air hung thick with worry, and the distant sounds of traffic filtered through the thin walls. Her voice was soft, but steady as she read from a worn library book about far-off adventures and brave heroes, trying to bring some comfort to their stark reality. The wind whispered through the ancient trees as Sarah stepped forward. Sophie paused when she heard her mother's breathing change. Maria's chest heaved with effort, each breath more labored than the last, the wheezing sound growing more pronounced. Suddenly, a violent coughing fit seized her mother's frail body, making the metal bed frame rattle against the wall. "Mom!" Sophie dropped the book, scrambling to help Maria sit up. The paperback thudded against the scuffed linoleum floor as panic gripped her chest. But Maria's eyes rolled back, and she slumped against the thin pillow, unconscious. "Mom! Wake up!" Her voice echoed off the bare walls. Sophie's hands shook as she grabbed her mother's old flip phone from the bedside table, nearly knocking over a glass of water in her haste. She dialed 911, her voice cracking as she gave their address to the dispatcher, repeating it twice to make sure they understood. The minutes waiting for the ambulance felt like hours as she held her mother's limp hand, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The paramedics arrived, in a blur of activity and urgent voices, their heavy boots thundering down the shelter's narrow hallway. Sophie watched them load her mother onto a stretcher, her heart pounding as she followed them into the ambulance. The siren wailed through the city streets as Maria lay still under an oxygen mask, the evening traffic parting before them like a tide. At the hospital, fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells assaulted Sophie's senses as doctors rushed her mother into emergency care. She paced the waiting room, wearing a path in the industrial carpet, until a tired-looking doctor with salt and pepper hair approached her, his white coat wrinkled from a long shift. "Your mother is stable for now," the doctor said, consulting his clipboard, the papers rustling as he flipped through them. "But her condition is serious. She needs specialized treatment, medication, ongoing care. Without insurance." He trailed off, his expression sympathetic but helpless, his pen tapping nervously against the clipboard. Sophie nodded numbly, her mind already racing. Back at the shelter, she dug through her mother's old cardboard box of belongings, pushing aside faded clothes and cherished mementos. Near the bottom, she found what she was looking for, a photograph, its edges worn but the image clear, protected by a plastic sleeve. It showed her mother, young and vibrant, laughing as a handsome young man held her close. Ethan Caldwell, before success had hardened his features and wealth had built walls around his heart. With renewed determination, Sophie made her way to Ethan's office building, its gleaming glass exteriors a stark contrast to the shelter she called home. This time, she managed to slip past security during a busy lunch hour, blending in with a group of delivery people. She found him alone in his office, staring out the window at the city sprawled below. "Look at this," Sophie said, holding out the photograph, her hand trembling slightly. "Look at her. Look at you both." Ethan turned, his face flushing with anger at the intrusion. But when his eyes fell on the photograph, he froze. His carefully maintained composure cracked as he stared at the image of his younger self and Maria, the happiness in their faces impossible to deny. "Where did you get that?" His voice was barely a whisper, emotion making it rough around the edges. "She's dying," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Her chin lifted in defiance. "She's in the hospital right now. You need to see her." Ethan sank into his leather chair, still staring at the photograph. Memories he'd buried years ago surfaced. Maria's laugh, their shared dreams, the way he'd walked away when his father had offered him a position in the family business, choosing ambition over love. "Please," Sophie said, her plea cutting through his thoughts. "Just come see her." After a long moment, Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of long-buried guilt. He followed Sophie to the hospital, each step heavy with reluctance, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floors. Now he stood in the doorway of Maria's room, staring at the pale woman in the hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors marking time. Sophie sat beside her mother, watching Ethan with a mixture of hope and challenge in her eyes. He hesitated at the threshold, his hand gripping the doorframe as emotions warred across his face, the past and present colliding in this sterile hospital room. The hospital room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Ethan's face as he stood awkwardly by the door, his expensive suit looking oddly out of place against the sterile walls. The steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell made him increasingly uncomfortable, bringing back unwanted memories of his own father's final days. His eyes kept darting between Sophie's determined face and Maria's frail form on the bed, unable to fully settle on either one. Natalie Green, ever efficient in her crisp navy pantsuit, stepped forward with a folder in hand, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. "I've arranged everything, Mr. Caldwell. The lab can process the DNA test immediately and with complete discretion. They're one of the most reputable facilities in the state." Sophie sat up straighter in her chair beside Maria's bed, her worn sweater a stark contrast to the pristine hospital sheets. "Mom needs to agree too," she said, her voice firm despite her obvious exhaustion, dark circles visible under her eyes. Maria's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak nod, her thin fingers clutching at the blanket. The technicians entered the room with their equipment, moving with practiced efficiency in their white coats. Sophie watched intently as they collected samples from each of them, first her mother, then herself, and finally Ethan, who maintained his stoic expression throughout the procedure, though his jaw clenched slightly at the needle prick. "The results should be available within days," the lead technician explained as they packed up their equipment, carefully labeling each sample. Ethan cleared his throat, tugging at his silk tie. "In the meantime," he said, addressing Sophie but looking somewhere past her shoulder, "I've arranged for you and your mother to stay at Cedar Grove Care Center. They have medical facilities that can properly treat your mother's condition. It's one of the best facilities in the region." Sophie's eyes narrowed with suspicion, her fingers curling protectively around her mother's hand. "We don't need your charity." "Sophie," Maria whispered from her bed, her voice barely audible over the humming machines. "Please." The girl's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of responsibility visible in her posture. She looked at her mother's pale face and nodded reluctantly, biting her lower lip. "Fine. But just until the results come back." Over the next few days, Ethan buried himself in work, scheduling back-to-back meetings and conference calls that left him exhausted but unable to sleep. But his mind kept wandering to the hospital room, to Maria's weakened state, to Sophie's fierce protective stance by her mother's bedside. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. At Cedar Grove, Sophie explored the facility with cautious appreciation, running her fingers along the smooth wooden handrails in the hallways. The rooms were clean and warm, with proper medical equipment monitoring her mother's condition. The staff treated them with respect, though Sophie noticed their curious glances and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. During the day, she sat by her mother's bedside, reading from library books she'd brought with her, her voice steady and soothing as she turned the worn pages. At night, she would curl up in the comfortable chair by the window, holding the worn photograph of her mother and Ethan in one hand and his business card in the other, studying the similarities between the younger man in the photo and the stern businessman she'd met. In his office, Ethan stood by the window, tumbler in hand, watching the clock tick past midnight as city lights twinkled below. His phone buzzed, a message from Natalie. "Lab results are ready?" His heart began to race as he stared at the screen. The stark white conference room at the lab felt suffocating as Ethan, Sophie, and Natalie waited for the results. The sanitized air and harsh fluorescent lighting only heightened their anxiety. The lab technician, Dr. Martinez, entered with a manila envelope clutched tightly in his hands, his expression carefully neutral behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Caldwell, we've completed the analysis," Dr. Martinez began, adjusting his glasses with slightly trembling fingers. "However, I'm afraid the results are inconclusive." "What do you mean, inconclusive?" Ethan's voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. Sophie's hands gripped the edge of the conference table, her knuckles turning white against the polished surface. Dr. Martinez spread several papers across the table, each one filled with complex charts and data points. The samples we collected, particularly from Ms. Maria, showed degraded markers. This can happen when a person is experiencing severe illness. Their cellular structure can be compromised, making it difficult to obtain clear genetic readings. We tried multiple times to get a definitive result. Sophie's face fell, and she blinked rapidly to hold back tears, her shoulders slumping with disappointment. "But that's not fair. We need to know. There has to be something you can do." "Can't we just run the test again?" Natalie asked, her practical nature taking over as she leaned forward in her chair. "Maybe with different samples?" Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room with measured steps that echoed against the sterile walls. "No," he said firmly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "This isn't getting us anywhere." He turned to Natalie, determination hardening his features. "Contact Jensen. Tell him I need his best investigator on this immediately. Money is no object." Over the next few days, Ethan immersed himself in the investigation, barely sleeping or eating. The private investigator's preliminary reports revealed fragments of Maria's life after college. A series of minimum wage jobs at local diners and retail stores, frequent moves between cheap apartments in increasingly dangerous neighborhoods, medical bills piling up like autumn leaves. Each detail made something twist uncomfortably in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in her mother's room at Cedar Grove, trying to piece together the timeline of her mother's stories. The steady beeping of medical monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts. She remembered tales of college romance, of dreams shared under starlit skies, of promises made in whispered voices. But now, certain details seemed to blur like watercolors in the rain. Had her mother said they met in sophomore or junior year? Was it at the library or the campus coffee shop? The uncertainty gnawed at her. "Mom," Sophie whispered to Maria's sleeping form, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. "I wish you could tell me everything clearly. I need to understand." In his office, Ethan reviewed photographs the investigator had uncovered, spread across his mahogany desk like pieces of a painful puzzle. Images of a younger Maria, working double shifts at greasy diners, living in cramped apartments with peeling wallpaper, always alone with a small child, Sophie. The stark reality of her struggle made his carefully maintained skepticism waver like a candle in the wind. The investigator's initial report lay open on his desk, highlighting a curious detail about someone from Maria's past. A name that appeared repeatedly in her employment history, but with little additional information. Something about it tugged at his memory. Ethan stared at the document, feeling the weight of uncovered truths pressing down on him like a physical force. At Cedar Grove, Sophie held her mother's frail hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the sterile hospital sheets. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, painting patterns on the linoleum floor. "I promise," she whispered, her voice thick with determination. "I'll find out what really happened. For both of us, no matter what it takes." The city lights twinkled like distant stars through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's penthouse. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, watching the ice clink against the sides, his eyes fixed on the manila envelope spread across his sleek coffee table. A photograph caught his attention. Maria in her college days, her smile radiating joy and possibility, her eyes holding that spark of creativity he'd always admired. Ethan's chest tightened as he picked up the photo, his fingers trembling slightly against the glossy paper. The memories he'd locked away for so long came rushing back like a flood, overwhelming in their intensity. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 21 again, standing in the bustling university courtyard, full of youthful confidence and ambition. Young Ethan adjusted his designer watch, a gift from his father, as he hurried across campus, his leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder. That's when he first saw her. Maria, perched on a stone wall, sketching in her worn notebook, completely absorbed in her art. Her dark hair caught the sunlight, dancing in the gentle breeze, and paint stains dotted her oversized denim jacket like a rainbow of badges. "You're blocking my light," she'd said without looking up, a hint of playfulness in her voice, the corner of her mouth lifting in a half-smile. Their love story unfolded like a whirlwind, each day bringing new discoveries. Late-night conversations at the campus coffee shop, where Maria shared her dreams of becoming an artist, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described her visions. Stolen kisses between classes, hidden behind ancient oak trees. Weekend adventures in her beat-up Volkswagen, driving nowhere in particular, singing along to scratchy radio tunes. Maria taught him to see beauty in imperfection, in the way sunlight filtered through autumn leaves, while he showed her the world through ambitious eyes, painting pictures of future success. "We'll conquer the world together," he'd promised one night as they lay on a blanket under the stars, their fingers intertwined. Maria had laughed, that musical sound that made his heart skip, her eyes reflecting the starlight above. But their bubble burst when Harrison Caldwell Sr. discovered their relationship. Ethan remembered the day clearly, his father's mahogany-paneled office, the suffocating smell of expensive cigars mingling with leather and power. An art student? His father's voice dripped with disdain, each word sharp as a knife. "The Caldwells have a legacy to uphold, son. She'll only hold you back from achieving your true potential." "She makes me happy, Dad," young Ethan had argued, his hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. "Happy doesn't build empires," his father had scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. "End it now or I'll cut you off. No more college, no seed money for your business ventures, no inheritance. Your choice." His father's eyes turned cold, reflecting the brass desk lamp's glow like frozen amber. The ultimatum hung heavy in the air, suffocating in its finality. Ethan had spent days agonizing over the decision, watching Maria sketch in the park, her face peaceful and unaware of the storm brewing, her pencil dancing across the paper with practiced grace. In the end, ambition won, destroying something precious in its wake. He'd approached her on a gray autumn morning, speaking rehearsed words about different paths and incompatible futures, each syllable tasting like ash in his mouth. Maria's sketchpad had fallen from her trembling hands, pages scattering in the wind like broken dreams. "Look at me," she'd pleaded, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking with emotion. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't love me." But he couldn't. Instead, he'd turned and walked away, each step feeling like lead, her sobs echoing in his ears like a haunting melody he'd never forget. In his penthouse, present-day Ethan opened his eyes, the memory fading, but the pain as fresh as ever. The photograph of young Maria stared back at him, her smile now seeming to hold a touch of sadness, an echo of what was to come. "I should have fought harder for us," he whispered into the empty room, the weight of his past choices settling heavily on his shoulders like an invisible burden. The ice in his glass had melted, much like his youthful dreams of having both success and love. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ethan's office as he knelt beside a cardboard box pulled from his storage closet. Dust motes danced in the golden light as he sifted through old college memorabilia, textbooks, photographs, and forgotten keepsakes from his youth. The musty scent of aged paper and leather bindings filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of late-night study sessions and ambitious dreams. His fingers brushed against something unexpected, a cream-colored envelope, yellowed with age, tucked between the pages of an economics textbook. His breath caught when he recognized the flowing script of his name written across the front, Maria's handwriting. The sight of it made his heart skip a beat, transporting him instantly back to simpler times. With trembling hands, he carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear its delicate edges. Inside, he found several pages of letter paper, covered in the same elegant penmanship. The date at the top made his stomach clench, just 2 months after their breakup. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers, like it might crumble with the weight of its long-held secrets. "Dear Ethan," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is my 4th letter to you. I don't know if you're receiving them, but I have to keep trying." The words seemed to echo in the quiet office, each one striking him like a physical blow. He sank into his leather office chair, gripping the pages tightly as he continued reading. Maria's words poured out her heartbreak, her confusion over his sudden departure, and her desperate attempts to reach him. The pain in her writing was so raw, so immediate, it felt as fresh as the day she'd penned it. "I know your father disapproves," one passage read, "but what we had was real. You can't just throw that away. There's something important you need to know." His throat tightened as he read on, each word adding to the growing weight in his chest. His eyes widened as he reached the middle of the letter. "I'm pregnant, Ethan. You're going to be a father. I've tried calling, visiting your dorm, everything. Please, just talk to me. We can figure this out together." The revelation hit him like a physical blow, making him grip the edge of his desk for support. The paper crinkled in his grip. 4th letter? He'd never received any of them, not one. The room seemed to spin as the implications hit him. Someone had deliberately kept these letters from reaching him. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Ethan grabbed his phone, hitting the speed dial for Natalie. She answered on the second ring. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone steady. "I need your help," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just found a letter from Maria from 12 years ago. She tried to contact me multiple times about the pregnancy. Someone intercepted her letters." The words tumbled out, urgent and desperate. "Are you sure?" Natalie asked, her professional tone tinged with concern. The familiar steadiness of her voice helped anchor him slightly. "Positive. I need you to help me track down what happened. There might be more letters, more attempts to contact me. We need to find them." He ran a hand through his hair, mind already racing with where to start looking. The letter trembled in his hand as he stared at Maria's words again. "Who kept this from me?" he whispered, anger and regret churning in his chest. The envelope lay on his desk, its edges worn and faded, a silent witness to years of buried truth. The setting sun threw long shadows across the paper, as if nature itself was trying to illuminate the secrets that had been hidden for so long. Ethan's luxury car screeched to a halt in front of his father's sprawling mansion, the tires crunching against the perfectly maintained circular driveway. The manicured lawns and pristine architecture that had once represented success now felt like monuments to deception, mocking him with their flawless facade. His hand shook as he gripped Maria's letter, its paper worn soft from age, striding through the grand entrance without waiting for the butler's announcement, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. James Caldwell sat in his study, a picture of calculated composure as he reviewed the financial section of his newspaper, seemingly undisturbed by his son's explosive entrance. The evening light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room's rich mahogany furnishings, highlighting the carefully curated symbols of wealth and power that surrounded him. "Did you do this?" Ethan's voice cracked as he slammed the letter onto his father's antique desk, causing the crystal paperweight to rattle. "Did you keep these from me?" James barely glanced at the yellowed envelope, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific, son." Maria's letters. She wrote to me about the pregnancy, about Sophie. Ethan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk, his whole body trembling with barely contained rage. "She tried to reach me multiple times." James folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, setting it aside with precise movements that only fueled Ethan's anger. "Ah, that unfortunate business. Answer me." "Yes," James said finally, his voice cold and measured like ice in a crystal tumbler. "I had our lawyer intercept any communication from that girl. She was becoming a nuisance, a distraction from your future." The admission hit Ethan like a physical blow, making him stagger back slightly. "You had no right." "I had every right," James countered, standing to pour himself a drink from the crystal decanter that caught the fading sunlight. "You were young, ambitious. That girl would have dragged you down with her claims and demands. I simply ensured your path remained clear." "Clear?" Ethan's voice rose, bouncing off the book-lined walls. "You manipulated my entire life. Maria needed me. Sophie needed me. And you just—" "I protected you," James cut in sharply, his carefully maintained composure finally showing cracks. "That girl was after our money, nothing more. These sorts of claims are common among her type. I merely saved you from a costly mistake." "Her type?" Ethan's anger boiled over, his face flushing red. "She was the woman I loved. And Sophie, she's my daughter, your granddaughter." James waved his hand dismissively, taking a slow sip of his drink. Unproven claims from a desperate woman. "They've been living in poverty while we—" Ethan's voice caught as the full weight of his father's actions sank in, nearly choking him with guilt. "They've been struggling all these years because of you, because of us." "Everything I did was for your benefit," James insisted, straightening his already perfect tie. "Look at what you've achieved. Would any of that have been possible with a scandal hanging over your head?" Ethan stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as the powerful figure he'd always feared and respected, but as a manipulative man who'd robbed him of his chance at real happiness. "You're wrong. What you did wasn't protection. It was cruel. It was selfish." He snatched the letter from the desk, backing away from his father as if from a stranger. "I won't let you control this anymore. I'm going to make this right." James called after him as he stormed toward the door, his voice sharp with warning. "Don't throw away everything we've built over some misplaced guilt." But Ethan was already moving, his footsteps echoing through the mansion's marble halls like drumbeats of rebellion. He yanked open his car door, slid behind the wheel, and pulled out his phone to call Natalie, his hand still shaking, but his voice steady with determination. "I need to fix this," he said firmly, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "No matter what it takes." The engine roared to life, and Ethan drove away from his father's estate, leaving behind the carefully constructed lies of his past. The setting sun cast long shadows across the driveway, marking the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another, one where truth and redemption would finally take precedence over appearance and power. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft hum of the air conditioning unit. Maria lay propped up against white pillows, her face pale, but her eyes alert, though dark circles shadowed them. Sophie sat close to her mother's bed, her small hand wrapped protectively around Maria's thin fingers, occasionally adjusting the thin blanket with her free hand. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expensive charcoal suit and polished leather shoes seemed out of place among the sterile walls, medical equipment, and the lingering scent of antiseptic. "Come in," Maria said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, rough from fatigue. Ethan stepped inside, his shoulders tense beneath his tailored jacket. He glanced at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly at her mother, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "Tell him, Mom. He needs to know everything." Maria took a shaky breath, the effort making her chest rise and fall noticeably. "It wasn't easy after you left, Ethan. I tried to keep going, to finish my art degree, but—" She paused, collecting her thoughts, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "I had to drop out. Took whatever jobs I could find. Waitressing, cleaning houses, anything to make ends meet. Some days I worked 16 hours straight." Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the rail until his knuckles turned white. "When did you find out about the pregnancy?" Maria's lips curved in a sad smile, memories flickering across her tired face. "About 2 months after you disappeared. I kept hoping you'd come back, that maybe you just needed time. I worked double shifts at the diner, saved every penny I could. The other waitresses would slip me extra food to take home." Sophie squeezed her mother's hand as Maria continued, her voice growing thinner. "We moved around a lot. Sometimes we'd find a small apartment, but when rent went up or work dried up, we'd end up in shelters. There were nights—" Her voice cracked, emotion bleeding through. "Nights when Sophie was small, and I couldn't afford both food and medicine when she got sick. I'd go hungry just to make sure she had enough." Ethan's face had grown increasingly pale, the color draining from his usually composed features. "Why didn't you come find me? Force me to help?" Pride, maybe. Fear. Maria's eyes met his, still showing traces of the spark that had once drawn him to her. "I saw you in the papers sometimes, rising in the business world. I didn't want to force myself into your life, demand things you weren't ready to give. Sophie deserved a father who wanted her, not one who felt obligated. I couldn't bear to see you turn us away." She paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking clearly taxing her weakened body. "When the doctors told me about the cancer, I knew I had to tell Sophie the truth. She deserved to know where she came from, even if—" Maria's voice trailed off, her energy flagging. "Even if what?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Even if you rejected her. She's strong, Ethan. Stronger than I ever was. I knew she could handle it. She's had to be strong her whole life." The monitors beeped steadily as Maria's energy began to fade, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the window blinds. Her eyes grew heavy, but she managed one last whisper. "I didn't want to burden you. I just wanted Sophie to have a chance." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he looked at the woman he'd once loved, now so fragile in her hospital bed, worn down by years of struggle and sacrifice. "I'll make this right," he promised softly, his voice catching. Sophie continued holding her mother's hand as Maria drifted into sleep, her breathing evening out. Ethan turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, his mind racing with everything he'd learned and the weight of years of absence pressing down on his shoulders. Ethan sat in his plush office chair, the city lights twinkling behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. In his hands, he held a photograph of Sophie he'd taken during their last meeting. Her eyes held a determination that reminded him so much of Maria, that same fierce spirit he'd once admired. He traced the edge of the photo with his finger, noting Sophie's worn but clean clothes, her straight posture despite everything she'd been through. The weight of missed opportunities and denied responsibilities pressed heavily on his chest. The next day, Ethan met Sophie at the public library where she usually studied. She looked up from her textbook, surprise flickering across her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I thought maybe I could help with your homework," Ethan said, pulling out a chair. "If that's okay with you." Sophie hesitated, then nodded. As they worked through her math problems, Ethan noticed how quickly she grasped complex concepts despite gaps in her education. Her intelligence shone through in every question she asked. Later that week, Ethan took Sophie to the Natural History Museum. Her eyes widened at the massive dinosaur skeletons and interactive exhibits. She moved from display to display, absorbing everything with intense curiosity. "Huh? Mom always said we'd come here someday," Sophie said quietly, staring up at a prehistoric marine creature. "But we could never afford it." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Well, now you can come whenever you want." He arranged for a private tutor, Ms. Chen, to work with Sophie 3 times a week. Sophie initially resisted, but her love of learning won out. Within weeks, she was catching up on years of missed education. "She's remarkably bright," Ms. Chen told Ethan after one session. "She just needed the opportunity." During their time together, Sophie slowly began sharing stories about her life, about moving between shelters, about helping her mother count pills and budget their meager resources, about dreaming of college while knowing it seemed impossible. Ethan found himself looking forward to their meetings, proud of every small achievement Sophie shared. Her resilience amazed him, how she'd maintained her spirit and determination despite everything life had thrown at her. One evening, after spending the afternoon at the museum, Ethan drove Sophie back to the shelter. The contrast between the gleaming scientific exhibits they'd just left and the rundown building where she lived struck him hard. Sophie gathered her backpack and stepped out of the car. She turned back briefly, a small smile on her face. "Thanks," she said, waving before heading inside. Ethan watched her go, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He pulled out his phone and dialed Natalie's number. "Set up a meeting with the best geneticist you can find," he said firmly. "I need answers." The state-of-the-art genetics lab gleamed with polished surfaces and high-tech equipment, the antiseptic smell mingling with the soft hum of advanced machinery. Ethan and Sophie sat side by side in comfortable leather chairs, while a tablet propped on a sleek metal stand showed Maria's tired but alert face via video call. Her image occasionally flickered as the connection wavered. The lab technician, Dr. Rivera, adjusted her pristine white coat and smiled warmly at them, her experienced hands arranging the testing supplies with practiced efficiency. "We'll be using the most advanced DNA sequencing available," Dr. Rivera explained, gesturing to the sophisticated machinery behind her that filled nearly an entire wall. "This method gives us a much more detailed analysis than standard paternity tests. We'll be able to map specific genetic markers with incredible precision." Sophie's small hand found Ethan's and squeezed tight, her fingers trembling slightly. He glanced down, surprised by the gesture, but touched by her trust. Over the past weeks, their cautious interactions had slowly evolved into something warmer, more natural, like ice melting in spring sunshine. The testing process began methodically. Dr. Rivera collected samples from both Ethan and Sophie, explaining each step with patient detail while demonstrating the collection process. The wait seemed endless as the machines hummed and processed their DNA, minutes stretching into hours that felt like days. Ethan found himself studying Sophie's profile as she watched the lab technician work, noting every familiar feature. The determined set of her jaw, the intelligent spark in her eyes, the way she wrinkled her nose in concentration. He'd grown to admire these traits, regardless of what the test might reveal. She fiddled with the silver charm bracelet he'd given her last week, a small gesture that had made her eyes light up with joy and brought an unexpected warmth to his heart. When Dr. Rivera finally returned with a thick manila folder, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with anticipation, the air electric with possibility. Maria leaned closer to her camera, her face filling more of the tablet screen, worry lines etched deeply around her eyes. "The results are conclusive," Dr. Rivera announced, her voice clear and professional as she opened the folder with steady hands. "Mr. Caldwell, you are indeed Sophie's biological father. The genetic markers match with 99.99% certainty. There's absolutely no doubt." Sophie's grip on Ethan's hand tightened until her knuckles turned white. Though they'd all expected this outcome, hearing it stated so definitively made it real in a way it hadn't been before, like a dream suddenly materializing into solid reality. "I always knew," Maria whispered through the video call, her smile weak but genuine, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never doubted it for a moment." Ethan felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs, his chest constricting with emotion. Feelings crashed over him in waves, shock, despite the likelihood of this result, guilt for all the years lost, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility and determination to make things right, to be the father Sophie deserved. As they prepared to leave the lab, Sophie looked up at him, her eyes full of questions and tentative hope. "Does this mean we're really family now?" Her voice wavered slightly with vulnerability. Ethan knelt down to her level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and meeting her gaze directly. "We always were," he replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. "This just makes it official on paper." They walked hand in hand toward the parking lot, their steps in sync, their bond stronger than ever before. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the pavement as they made their way to the car, each step taking them closer to their new future together. The grand atrium of Caldwell Enterprises buzzed with anticipation. Camera flashes lit up the space like lightning as reporters jostled for position, their equipment trained on the empty podium. Behind it, the Caldwell Company logo gleamed on the wall, a testament to the empire Ethan had built. The morning sun filtered through the glass ceiling, casting long shadows across the marble floor and highlighting the nervous energy that filled the room. Natalie Green stood off to the side, her usual composure showing cracks as she checked her tablet one last time. Her fingers drummed against the screen, betraying her nerves about the unprecedented announcement they were about to make. She tugged at her blazer sleeve and exchanged worried glances with the PR team hovering nearby. Ethan stepped up to the podium, his tailored suit immaculate, but his expression more human than the public had ever seen. The clicking of cameras intensified as he adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing through the hushed space. His hands, usually steady during presentations, trembled slightly as he arranged his notes. "I am here today not as a CEO, but as a father," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I want to introduce you to my daughter, Sophie." Sophie emerged from behind the curtain, her simple blue dress a stark contrast to the corporate setting. Her steps were measured as she joined Ethan at the podium, her chin held high despite the butterflies in her stomach. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder as the room erupted with questions, the cacophony of voices bouncing off the atrium's walls. "Mr. Caldwell, when did you learn about your daughter?" "Sophie, how do you feel about this public announcement?" "Was there a financial settlement involved?" Ethan raised his hand for silence, commanding the room with the same authority he used in board meetings. "I want to be completely transparent," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised many who knew him only as a ruthless businessman. "Until recently, I was unaware of Sophie's existence. This wasn't her fault, or her mother's. The circumstances that kept us apart were complicated, but what matters now is that I'm here, and I'm committed to being the father she deserves." The questions continued, and Ethan answered each one with unexpected candor. He spoke about his college relationship with Maria, his regret at their separation, and the joy of discovering Sophie. Some reporters nodded appreciatively at his honesty, while others scribbled furiously, likely crafting more sensational angles. Camera phones appeared among the professional equipment, capturing every moment of this rare display of vulnerability from one of the city's most powerful men. In the back of the room, several board members watched with growing concern, their expensive suits doing little to hide their discomfort. Thomas Wheeler, the most senior among them, whispered harshly to his colleagues, his face growing redder by the minute. Their disapproving glances and tight-lipped expressions spoke volumes about their reaction to this public revelation. During a brief pause, Wheeler approached Natalie, his designer shoes clicking against the floor. "This is going to tank our stock," he muttered through clenched teeth. "The shareholders won't stand for this kind of drama." Ethan overheard and turned to address him directly, his voice carrying through the microphone with quiet authority. "Our company has always claimed to value integrity and family. Today, I'm living those values. If some find that controversial, perhaps they should question their priorities, not mine." The response earned scattered applause from the reporters and a proud smile from Sophie. Wheeler retreated, his face red with barely contained anger, straightening his tie as he melted back into the crowd of onlookers. As the questions wound down, Sophie squeezed Ethan's hand and whispered, "Thank you for standing up for me." Ethan looked down at his daughter, a warm smile spreading across his face. The fulfillment he felt in that moment outweighed any corporate accolades he'd ever received. For the first time in his career, he knew without doubt that he was doing exactly the right thing. The sterile hospital room felt smaller than usual as Ethan entered, carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. The antiseptic smell hung heavy in the air, mingling with the lingering scent of institutional cleaning products. Maria lay propped up against white pillows, her face pale but alert, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows under her eyes. A small TV mounted on the wall quietly played footage from the press conference, the tinny sound barely audible above the steady beep of medical equipment. "You did well," Maria said softly, her eyes moving between Ethan and the screen. "Sophie looks happy standing next to you, like she belongs there." Ethan placed the flowers on the bedside table, arranging them carefully to brighten the dreary space. "She's amazing. You raised her to be strong, Maria. She has your spirit." A shadow crossed Maria's face, and she twisted the thin hospital blanket between her fingers, her knuckles whitening with tension. "There's something I need to tell you, Ethan. Something I've been keeping from everyone. Something that's been eating at me." Ethan pulled a chair closer to her bed, the metal leg scraping against the linoleum floor. Concern etched his features as he settled in. Maria took a shaky breath before continuing, her shoulders trembling slightly. "When Sophie was 9, I got really sick for the first time. We had no insurance, no savings. I was desperate. Her voice trembled. "That's when I met Vincent Moretti. He found me crying outside the free clinic." "A loan shark?" Ethan asked, his jaw tightening as his mind raced through the implications. Maria nodded, her fingers still working nervously at the blanket. "He seemed kind at first. Understood my situation," he said. "Offered to help like a guardian angel. But once I took the money—" She closed her eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. "The interest kept growing. When I couldn't pay, he started showing up at the shelter, following us, making threats about Sophie." Ethan leaned forward, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? I could have helped." "I was ashamed and scared." Maria's voice dropped to a whisper, her words barely audible. "Vincent's been watching us for months now. He knows about Sophie's school, our routines. Last week he was here at the hospital, just standing in the doorway, smiling that terrible smile of his." "Here?" Ethan's voice rose sharply, echoing off the sterile walls. "I've tried to keep Sophie away from him, but now that she's in the news—" Maria's words trailed off as fear crept into her expression, her face growing even paler. Ethan stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. His expensive shoes clicked against the floor with each turn. "How much do you owe him?" Maria told him the amount, her voice small with shame. Ethan stopped pacing, his expression hardening as she detailed Vincent's escalating threats and intimidation tactics, each word making his blood boil hotter. "I'll handle this," Ethan said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Maria shook her head weakly, her hair rustling against the pillow. "You don't know Vincent. He's dangerous, Ethan. He has connections, people who do his dirty work." "Write down everything you know about him," Ethan insisted, pulling out his phone with determined efficiency. "His contact information, where he operates, everything. Leave nothing out." With trembling hands, Maria wrote the details on a hospital notepad, the pen scratching quietly against the paper. Ethan took the paper, his expression grim as he read Vincent's name and information, committing every detail to memory. Back in his car, Ethan stared at the notepad, his anger building like a gathering storm. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windshield as he pulled out his phone and dialed Natalie's number. "Get me someone who knows how to deal with this. Quietly," he said into the phone, his eyes fixed on Vincent's name, his tone leaving no room for questions or hesitation. The autumn afternoon cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Sophie made her way home from the library, her backpack heavy with borrowed books and her shoulders aching from the weight. Her mind wandered to the physics homework she'd been working on, proud of how quickly she was catching up with her studies thanks to Ethan's help. The cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching rain. A black sedan with chrome trim slowed beside her, its tinted windows reflecting the setting sun like dark mirrors. Before Sophie could process what was happening, two muscular men in dark clothing emerged from the vehicle with practiced efficiency. One grabbed her arms, while the other clamped a rough, calloused hand over her mouth, the scent of leather gloves filling her nostrils. "Help!" Sophie managed to scream, before being forced into the vehicle's plush leather interior. A woman walking her golden retriever shouted and pulled out her phone, frantically dialing. Several bystanders pointed and yelled, some reaching for their phones too. But the car peeled away from the curb with squealing tires, leaving only the acrid smell of burning rubber and scattered leaves in its wake. In his office, Ethan was reviewing quarterly company reports when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered, his blood running cold at the gravelly voice on the other end, a voice he hadn't heard in 15 years. "Mr. Caldwell," Vincent Moretti said smoothly, almost pleasantly. I believe I have something that belongs to you." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "If you hurt her." "That depends entirely on you," Vincent cut in, his tone hardening. $10 million. Cash. You have 6 hours. In the warehouse, Sophie sat tied to a rusted metal chair, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through gaps in the old wooden walls, she could make out the skeletal frame of an abandoned water tower looming against the darkening sky. The distant sound of ships' horns and the salty air told her she was near the harbor. She memorized every detail: the pattern of rust on the metal beams, the stack of old crates in the corner, the particular rhythm of the waves, knowing Ethan would be looking for her. Ethan's normally pristine office transformed into a command center within minutes. Natalie coordinated with their security expert Marcus Chen, who traced the call while monitoring traffic cameras and satellite feeds. Detailed maps of the city's waterfront district covered Ethan's mahogany desk, marked with potential locations and escape routes. "No police!" Vincent's voice crackled through the speaker during his second call, the threat clear in every syllable. "I have eyes everywhere, Caldwell. 1 squad car, 1 uniform, and your daughter pays the price." Ethan's face contorted with rage, his jaw clenching. "She's innocent in this, Vincent. Your quarrel is with Maria." "Business is business," Vincent replied coldly, his words like ice. "The clock is ticking." Marcus leaned forward, his glasses reflecting the computer screen as he pointed to several potential locations on the map. "These warehouses match the industrial zone where we traced the call. The signal triangulation puts them in this 3-block radius." Ethan's phone buzzed with a text. The image of Sophie, scared but defiant in her blue sweater, made his stomach lurch. Her eyes held a message of determination despite the fear visible on her face. The caption beneath read, "TikTok." "We end this tonight," Ethan declared to Natalie and the security team, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. His fingers traced the edge of the map as he began formulating a plan. The conference room hummed with focused energy as Ethan leaned over a digital map, surrounded by his team. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he studied every detail. Natalie stood beside him, her fingers flying across a tablet as she coordinated with the tech experts who analyzed surveillance footage from the kidnapping route. Marcus Chen, the security expert, pointed to several markings on the screen, his expression grim but determined. "Sophie's been helping us more than Vincent realizes," Marcus said, admiration clear in his voice. "The fabric she dropped matches this path exactly, and those scratches she left on the car were visible in 3 different traffic cameras. She's one smart kid." Ethan nodded, pride mixing with worry as his heart clenched. She remembered everything we discussed about staying aware in unfamiliar places. "Look here." She mentioned seeing a water tower through the walls, even noticed the rust patterns on its legs. The tech team cross-referenced the clues with satellite imagery, their fingers dancing across keyboards as they narrowed down their search to an industrial zone on the city's outskirts. An abandoned warehouse complex filled their screens, its broken windows staring back at them like empty eyes. "This has to be it," Natalie confirmed, highlighting the location with quick, precise movements. "The building matches Sophie's description perfectly, right down to the missing section of roof." As the team geared up with tactical equipment, checking Kevlar vests and radio connections, Ethan's phone rang. Vincent's number flashed on the screen, making his stomach lurch. "I hope you're not planning anything foolish, Caldwell." Vincent's voice dripped with smugness, each word landing like a punch. "You see, I had some inside help making sure everything went smoothly." Ethan's blood ran cold as Vincent continued, his knuckles white around the phone. "Your father's been quite helpful. James was quite concerned about your public image problems. He made sure I knew exactly how to find your little girl, right down to her daily schedule." "You're lying?" Ethan growled, but deep down he knew it was true. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "Ask him yourself," Vincent chuckled. The line clicked, and James Caldwell's voice came through, as controlled and imperious as ever. "Son, this is for your own good," James said firmly, his tone the same one he'd used during childhood lectures. "That girl and her mother will destroy everything we've built. Our reputation—" "Our reputation?" Ethan's voice shook with rage, his free hand clenching into a fist. "You helped kidnap my daughter to protect our reputation?" "She's not worthy of the Caldwell name," James insisted, cold and calculating. "This is business, Ethan. Nothing personal. Sometimes sacrifices must be made." Ethan ended the call, his hands trembling with suppressed fury. Natalie touched his shoulder gently, her eyes full of concern. "Ethan?" "We stick to the plan," he said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Sophie needs us. Nothing else matters right now. Not the company, not our name, not him." The security team finished their preparations, checking weapons and communication devices with practiced efficiency. Ethan pulled out his wallet, looking at Sophie's photo, her bright smile, so full of life, before tucking it away safely. "I'm coming, Sophie." "Hold on," he whispered as they moved toward their vehicles, his determination burning away the bitter taste of betrayal. The team rolled out into the night, their convoy of black SUVs cutting through the darkness like shadows. They headed for the warehouse where Sophie waited, while Ethan pushed aside the burning betrayal in his heart, focusing solely on bringing his daughter home. Nothing would stop him now. Not Vincent, not his father, not anyone. The grand mahogany doors of James Caldwell's study trembled as Ethan burst in, his face flushed with anger. His father sat behind his massive desk, maintaining his usual air of calm superiority. "How could you?" Ethan's voice cracked with emotion. "She's just a child." James adjusted his expensive tie, unmoved. "Everything I did was to protect what we've built. The Caldwell name means something in this city." "She could die." Ethan slammed his hands on the desk. "Vincent Moretti is dangerous, and you helped him get to her." "Don't be dramatic," James waved dismissively. "Moretti knows better than to harm her. This is simply business." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Business? You deliberately sabotaged my rescue efforts. Tell me how you did it." James finally met his son's gaze. "I had some of your security team redirected to false locations, made sure certain resources weren't immediately available." Meanwhile, in the dimly lit warehouse, Sophie examined the rusty pipe running along her holding cell's wall. She'd noticed it wobbling earlier when one of the guards bumped against it. Working quietly, she wiggled it free from its mounting. Using the pipe as leverage, Sophie pried at the door's aging lock. Her heart pounded with each metallic scrape, but the guards' voices remained distant. With a final push, the lock gave way. Sophie slipped into the corridor, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor. She dragged the pipe's end along the wall, leaving distinct marks. At corners, she knocked over empty boxes, arranging them to point the way she'd gone. "Hey, the girl's gone!" A shout echoed through the warehouse. Sophie ducked behind a stack of crates as heavy footsteps thundered past. She held her breath, clutching the pipe tightly. Once the guards passed, she darted to a darker section of the warehouse, continuing to leave her trail of breadcrumbs. Back at the estate, Ethan stood over his father, trembling with rage. "You've betrayed your own granddaughter." "She's not worthy of being a Caldwell," James replied coldly. "Neither was her mother." Ethan turned away, disgust written across his face. "You're wrong. Sophie has shown more courage and integrity than you ever have." In the warehouse, Sophie crouched in a shadowy corner, listening to the guards searching nearby. She'd left enough clues, scratches on walls, overturned boxes, even an arrow drawn in dust pointing to her location. Now she just had to stay hidden until help arrived. "He'll come," she whispered, gripping the pipe that had won her freedom. "I know he will." The dark silhouettes of 3 black SUVs rolled silently toward the abandoned warehouse, their headlights off to maintain stealth. Ethan sat in the lead vehicle, his heart pounding as he studied the building's outline against the night sky. The security expert, Marcus, pointed to several entry points on a digital blueprint. "We've identified likely guard positions based on thermal imaging," Marcus explained in a low voice. "Team A will create a diversion at the loading dock, while Team B secures the perimeter. Mr. Caldwell and I will lead Team C through the east entrance, following the trail of markers Sophie left." Ethan nodded, checking his bulletproof vest. "Remember, Sophie's safety is the priority. No unnecessary risks." The teams moved into position with practiced efficiency. Through his earpiece, Ethan heard Natalie coordinating from the mobile command center. All teams in position, awaiting your signal." Inside the warehouse, Sophie pressed herself deeper into her hiding spot as footsteps echoed nearby. She gripped the metal pipe tightly, ready to defend herself if needed. The sound of breaking glass, followed by shouts from the loading dock, made her heart leap. Something was happening. Ethan's team breached the east entrance, moving swiftly through the darkness. They followed Sophie's trail of overturned boxes and wall markings, neutralizing 2 guards with quick precision. The sound of the diversion drew most of Vincent's men away, exactly as planned. Sophie heard the commotion growing closer. Taking a chance, she struck her pipe against a steel support beam 3 times. The metallic clanging reverberated through the warehouse. "There," Ethan whispered, recognizing the sound as a signal. He moved faster, Marcus close behind. 2 more strikes of the pipe guided them to a stack of old shipping containers. Ethan rounded the corner and saw Sophie crouched in the shadows. Their eyes met, and relief flooded through both of them. "Dad," Sophie whispered, dropping the pipe and running to him. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, but their reunion was cut short by slow clapping behind them. Vincent Moretti emerged from behind a container, pistol raised. "How touching," Vincent sneered. "The prodigal father saves his precious daughter." Ethan immediately pushed Sophie behind him, shielding her with his body. "It's over, Vincent. The building is surrounded." Vincent's finger tightened on the trigger. "Nothing's over until I—" A flash of movement caught him off guard as Natalie and 2 security team members descended from above, having positioned themselves on the container walkways. In one fluid motion, they disarmed Vincent and forced him to his knees. "Actually," Natalie said, securing Vincent's hands with zip ties, "it is over." Vincent struggled and cursed as more team members emerged from the shadows, securing the area. Outside, police sirens began to wail, growing closer. Ethan turned back to Sophie, checking her for injuries. Her face was dirty and tear-stained, but she managed a brave smile. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "I'll always come for you," Ethan replied, lifting her into his arms as they made their way toward the exit. The sterile hospital corridor seemed endless as Ethan approached Maria's room. His usual confident stride faltered, replaced by hesitant steps that betrayed his inner turmoil. Through the doorway, he saw Maria lying in bed, her once vibrant presence diminished by illness. Sophie sat vigilantly by her side, clutching her mother's frail hand. Maria's eyes met Ethan's, and she managed a weak smile that touched something deep within him. Sophie looked up, her expression a mix of protection and resignation, as she reluctantly stood from her chair. "It's okay, sweetheart," Maria whispered to Sophie. "Give us a moment." Sophie squeezed her mother's hand before stepping away, casting a meaningful look at Ethan as she passed him. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders as he took the vacant seat beside Maria's bed. "Maria, Ethan's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Maria watched him quietly as he struggled to find the right words. His carefully maintained composure crumbled as years of buried guilt surfaced. "I was selfish," he continued, his voice thick. "I chose ambition over love, over family. I didn't just abandon you. I abandoned our future, our child. I'll never forgive myself for the hardships you and Sophie endured because of my choices." Maria's breathing came in labored whispers, but her eyes remained clear and focused on Ethan. "The past is past," she said softly. "I want to make things right," Ethan said, gently taking her hand. "I know I can't undo what's been done, but I want to do better. I have to do better." Maria's fingers tightened slightly around his. "I forgive you, Ethan," she said, each word carefully measured. "But I need your promise, your absolute promise, that you'll take care of our daughter. Love her, protect her, help her become everything she can be." Tears spilled down Ethan's cheeks as he nodded. "I promise, Maria, with everything I am. I promise." A peaceful smile crossed Maria's face. "Sophie," she called softly. "Come here, my brave girl." Sophie rushed back to her mother's side, and Maria reached for her hand. "Listen to me, sweetheart. You are so strong, so incredibly strong. Trust your father. He will take care of you now. Remember who you are, what we've been through together. You can face anything." Sophie's tears fell freely as she pressed her mother's hand to her cheek. Maria's breathing grew more shallow, her eyes heavy with fatigue, but filled with love as she looked at her daughter one last time. Then, surrounded by the two people she loved most, Maria slipped away peacefully. Sophie's anguished cry filled the room as she collapsed against her mother's still form. And Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her close as her body shook with sobs. "I'll keep my promise," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll take care of you, Sophie. Always." As Sophie cried in his embrace, Ethan looked at Maria's peaceful face, silently recommitting himself to the vow he had made. He would honor her final wish, no matter what it took. Sophie sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of her new room in Ethan's penthouse, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing her mother's belongings. Her fingers traced the soft edges of Maria's favorite silk scarf, the familiar floral pattern now blurred by her tears. The scent of her mother's perfume still clung faintly to the fabric, triggering fresh waves of grief that shook her small frame. From the doorway, Ethan watched helplessly, his hand gripping the doorframe. All his wealth, his influence, his business acumen, none of it prepared him for this moment. The sight of his daughter's pain left him feeling utterly inadequate. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into trying to connect with Sophie. He cleared his schedule, shocking his executive team by taking an extended leave of absence. His attempts at cooking breakfast resulted in burned toast and runny eggs, but he persisted, determined to show Sophie he was there for her. During quiet afternoons, he would sit silently in Sophie's room, respecting her space while making his presence known. He offered to take her to the art museum where Maria used to sketch, or to the small cafe where she had worked during college. Sophie's initial responses were barely perceptible shakes of her head, her grief forming an invisible wall between them. But Ethan refused to give up. One evening, as Sophie picked at her dinner, he began sharing stories about Maria in college, how she would paint in the rain, her infectious laugh during their study sessions, the way she could make friends with anyone she met. For the first time since the funeral, Sophie looked up, really looked at him, drinking in these precious details about her mother. Encouraged by this small breakthrough, Ethan arranged a private memorial. He transformed the penthouse's meditation room with soft candlelight and photos of Maria. Together, they lit candles and placed them around her favorite photograph. Ethan shared more memories, and slowly, Sophie began to open up too, telling stories about her mother's courage during their hardest times. "She used to sing to me when we couldn't afford heat," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She'd wrap us in all our blankets and make up silly songs about warm sunshine." After the memorial, Sophie wrapped her arms around Ethan in a tight embrace. "Thank you for trying," she whispered against his chest. Ethan held her close, his voice rough with emotion as he promised, "I'll never stop trying." They sat together on the floor, a photo of Maria's radiant smile between them, their shared grief slowly transforming into a bridge of understanding. Ethan stood in his corner office, gazing at the wall calendar covered in color-coded meetings and deadlines. The familiar sight that once energized him now felt hollow. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant's number. "Cancel everything except the quarterly board meeting," he instructed, "and set up a call with the executive team. I'm delegating most of my responsibilities for the foreseeable future." His assistant's surprised silence spoke volumes, but she complied without question. Ethan gathered a few personal items from his desk, including a new photo of Sophie he'd placed there recently. Without a backward glance, he walked out of the office that had been his second home for so many years. Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into learning about parenting with the same intensity he'd once reserved for business deals. He attended evening classes at the local community center, where other parents shared their experiences and challenges. The instructor's gentle guidance helped him understand the importance of patience and consistent support. His coffee table, once cluttered with financial reports, now held books on child psychology and building trust with teens. He scheduled regular sessions with a family therapist who specialized in helping parents reconnect with their children after long separations. The real joy, however, came from the small moments with Sophie. Their first attempt at making pancakes together ended with flour everywhere and slightly burned edges. But Sophie's laughter made it perfect. He discovered she had inherited Maria's artistic talent and immediately converted his home office into an art studio for her. During homework sessions, Ethan found himself learning alongside Sophie, amazed by how much school curriculum had changed. Their evening walks in Central Park became a cherished routine, where Sophie would share stories about her day or ask questions about his life before they met. Natalie visited one afternoon to discuss some pending company matters and found Ethan in jeans and a casual sweater, helping Sophie with a science project. "I barely recognize you anymore," she remarked, watching him carefully arrange materials for Sophie's experiment. "And that's a good thing." Ethan smiled, realizing he barely recognized himself either. The expensive suits and power meetings that once defined him held little appeal now. Instead, he measured his days by Sophie's smiles, her gradual opening up to him, and the trust slowly building between them. That evening, as Ethan tucked Sophie into bed after a day filled with laughter and shared discoveries, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "I'm glad you're my dad," she whispered softly. Ethan's heart swelled with emotion as he replied, "I'm glad you're my daughter." Stepping into the hallway, he felt a peace he'd never known in all his years of corporate success. The morning sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows as Ethan and Sophie shared a quiet breakfast. Sophie was explaining her latest art project when Ethan's phone buzzed. Derek Caldwell's name flashed across the screen, making Ethan's jaw tighten. After a moment's hesitation, he answered, "Son, this has gone on long enough." Derek's stern voice filled the line. "The board members are concerned about the company's image. Your association with the girl. It's damaging our reputation." Ethan stepped away from the breakfast table, lowering his voice. "Her name is Sophie, and she's my daughter." "Think about what you're throwing away," Derek pressed. "Everything we've built, everything I've sacrificed to create this legacy." "You mean everything you've manipulated," Ethan cut in, his voice sharp. "The letters you intercepted, the relationships you destroyed. Those weren't sacrifices, Dad. They were selfish choices that hurt innocent people." "I did what was necessary to protect our family's interests," Derek insisted. "The Caldwell name means something in this city. You're tarnishing decades of hard work by embracing this situation so publicly." "No," Ethan said firmly. "I'm building a real family with my daughter, something you never understood the value of." After ending the call, Ethan stood at the window, his reflection showing the strain on his face. Weeks passed, and he systematically removed Derek from his life. He declined invitations to family events, ignored business proposals, and refused to engage in any discussion about the company's future. The emotional toll of this separation weighed heavily on Ethan. Late at night, he would find himself thinking about the life he could have had with Maria and Sophie if Derek hadn't interfered. The birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments stolen from them fueled a deep resentment. Sophie noticed the change in her father's demeanor. One evening, she found him lost in thought in his study. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch brought Ethan back to the present. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some things." "About your dad?" Sophie's perception surprised him. "You know, it's okay to be sad about him, even if he did bad things." Ethan pulled her into a hug, drawing strength from her wisdom and compassion. Their embrace said more than words could express, cementing their bond even further. Later that night, Ethan stood in his study, staring at an old family portrait. Derek's stern face looked back at him, a reminder of years of control and manipulation. Without hesitation, Ethan took down the photo and replaced it with a recent picture of himself and Sophie at the park, both smiling genuinely at the camera. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Ethan's car pulled into Emily Caldwell's driveway. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, betraying his nervousness about seeing his sister after so many years. Sophie sat quietly beside him, taking in the modest but well-kept suburban home with its cheerful flower boxes and warm yellow door. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice slightly unsteady. Before Sophie could answer, the front door opened and Emily appeared. She was dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a stark contrast to the formal attire favored by the Caldwell family. Her eyes welled with tears as she saw Ethan step out of the car. "Little brother," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug, "it's been too long." Emily's warmth immediately put Sophie at ease. Inside, they settled in Emily's cozy living room, where family photos covered the walls and shelves held well-worn books instead of expensive artifacts. "Would you like some hot chocolate, Sophie?" Emily asked, already heading to the kitchen. "I remember how Ethan used to drink gallons of it when we were kids." As Emily prepared their drinks, she shared stories that made Sophie see her father in a new light. "Your dad wasn't always so serious," she said, laughing. "Once, he dressed up as a superhero and tried to fly off the garden shed. Mom was horrified, but he was so proud of his cape." Ethan blushed. but Sophie could see the happiness in his eyes as he remembered those moments. Emily continued sharing memories, painting pictures of summer adventures and holiday celebrations before Derek's controlling nature cast its shadow over their lives. "I left when I was 22, Emily explained, her expression growing serious. Dad wanted to arrange my marriage to a business partner's son. He'd already planned my whole life, which company I would work for, where I would live, even how many children I should have." She squeezed Sophie's hand. "But I wanted to make my own choices, just like your dad is doing now." Sophie absorbed every word, understanding more about why her father had struggled to break free from Derek's influence. Emily's stories helped her see the complicated web of expectations and control that had shaped Ethan's early decisions. Throughout the afternoon, Emily took on a natural mentoring role with Sophie. She listened intently to Sophie's dreams of becoming an artist, offering encouragement and practical advice. When Sophie mentioned missing her mother, Emily shared her own experiences of loss and healing, creating a safe space for Sophie to express her grief. "You know," Emily said softly, "sometimes family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to stand by you and love you unconditionally." The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Ethan struggled to open his eyes. His head felt heavy, and a dull ache spread through his muscles. Brushing it off as simple exhaustion from recent events, he forced himself out of bed and headed to the kitchen where Sophie was already eating breakfast. "Dad, you don't look so good," Sophie said, her forehead creasing with concern. Ethan managed a weak smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But as the hours passed, his condition deteriorated rapidly. His face grew pale, and a persistent cough racked his body. Mrs. Harris, their trusted housekeeper, watched him with growing concern until she finally put her foot down. "That's enough, Mr. Caldwell. I'm calling Dr. Peterson." The doctor arrived promptly, his examination thorough and professional. "Severe viral infection," he diagnosed, shaking his head. "You need complete bed rest, Mr. Caldwell. No work, no stress, just rest and care." Sophie immediately took charge, surprising everyone with her determination. She organized his medication schedule with Mrs. Harris, ensuring he never missed a dose. Throughout the day, she brought him soup, adjusted his pillows, and read to him from her favorite books. "You don't have to do all this," Ethan protested weakly one afternoon. Sophie looked up from the book she was reading. "Yes, I do. You're my dad." The simple statement brought tears to Ethan's eyes. Despite losing her mother so recently, here she was, channeling her grief into caring for him. Mrs. Harris watched from the doorway, smiling at their growing bond. Emily visited regularly, bringing homemade remedies and staying to chat with Sophie. During one such visit, she called Derek to update him on family matters, mentioning Ethan's illness in passing. In his massive study, Derek sat frozen after hearing the news. He stared at his reflection in the window, seeing for the first time the cost of his controlling nature. The image of Sophie tending to her sick father, a father she'd only recently gotten to know because of his interference, weighed heavily on his conscience. His eyes drifted to a photo on his desk, one he'd kept hidden in a drawer for years. It showed a young Ethan with Mariah at a college event, both of them beaming with joy. Derek picked up the frame, his fingers tracing the image of his son's carefree smile. A smile he hadn't seen in years. The realization of how much happiness he'd destroyed hit him hard. He'd robbed Ethan of years of fatherhood, denied Sophie a loving parent, all in the name of preserving the family's reputation. As he sat there, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical burden. One morning, Ethan woke up feeling slightly stronger. The fever had finally broken, and his head felt clearer. He turned to find Sophie asleep in the armchair beside his bed, her hand resting protectively on his arm. The sight filled his heart with profound gratitude and love. The living room was quiet, except for the gentle rustling of pages as Ethan and Sophie sat reading together. Sophie was curled up on the plush armchair, engrossed in her science textbook, while Ethan reviewed some documents from work. The peaceful moment was interrupted by an unexpected ring of the doorbell. Ethan exchanged a curious glance with Sophie before rising to answer it. When he opened the door, he found his father, Derek Caldwell, standing there. The usually imposing man looked different. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and his eyes held an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Ethan," Derek's voice wavered. "May I come in?" After a moment's hesitation, Ethan stepped aside. Derek entered, his eyes finding Sophie in the living room before returning to his son. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Derek began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong about everything. The way I interfered in your life, how I kept you from Maria and Sophie." He paused, collecting himself. "I caused so much pain, all because of my foolish pride and obsession with our family's image." Ethan stood silently, watching his father's unusual display of vulnerability. "I understand if you can't forgive me," Derek continued, "but I needed to tell you how deeply sorry I am for all of it." The silence stretched between them until Sophie quietly approached, standing near Ethan. Her presence seemed to give Ethan strength as he considered his father's words. "It won't be easy," Ethan finally said, "but everyone deserves a chance to make things right." Over the following weeks, Derek proved his sincerity through consistent actions. He showed up at Sophie's school art exhibition, spending time studying each piece and asking thoughtful questions about her techniques. He helped her with mathematics homework, drawing on his business experience to make the problems more engaging. Sophie's initial wariness gradually melted away as she discovered a different side to her grandfather. During one afternoon at the museum, Derek shared stories about his own childhood dreams of becoming an artist before his father pushed him into business. Sophie found herself relating to him in unexpected ways. Ethan watched these interactions with a mixture of caution and hope. He noticed how his father's stern demeanor had softened, how genuine smiles now replaced his usual serious expression. During family dinners, Derek would listen intently to Sophie's stories about school and her friends, offering encouragement and support. The transformation in their family dynamic was subtle but significant. While the past couldn't be erased, Derek's genuine efforts to make amends brought a sense of healing. Sophie's natural warmth and forgiveness helped bridge the gap, creating new possibilities for their relationship. One evening, Derek sat with Sophie at the kitchen table, helping her with a science project about renewable energy. Their heads were bent together over colorful diagrams as Derek offered suggestions and praised her ideas. From the doorway, Ethan watched them, a small smile playing on his lips. "Sophie," Derek said softly, looking at his granddaughter with genuine affection, "I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." Sophie burst into Ethan's home office, her report card clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she presented it to him. Ethan carefully took the document, his expression brightening as he read through the straight A's and glowing comments from her teachers. "Look at these remarks," he said, pointing to one particular note. "Sophie shows exceptional critical thinking and leadership skills. Your teachers really see your potential." Sophie beamed, but then grew quiet for a moment. "I just want to make Mom proud," she said softly. "I want to excel in everything I do, just like she always believed I could." Ethan pulled her into a gentle hug. "Your mother would already be incredibly proud of you, Sophie. She always knew how special you are." A few days later, during their weekly family dinner, Sophie cleared her throat nervously. "I've been thinking about something," she began, setting down her fork. "What if we opened a shelter for women like Mom? Women who've been abandoned by their families." Ethan and Derek both looked up, intrigued. "It could be a safe place," Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. "We could provide resources, help them find jobs, maybe even offer education programs. No one should have to struggle alone like Mom did." Ethan's eyes softened with pride and emotion. "That's a wonderful idea, Sophie. We could absolutely make that happen." "We could call it Maria's Haven," Sophie suggested, her eyes bright with purpose. "Perfect," Ethan agreed immediately. "I'll have my team start looking for suitable properties tomorrow." Derek leaned forward, clearly moved by Sophie's proposal. "I could help with fundraising," he offered. "I have connections with several charitable foundations who might be interested in supporting this cause." Sophie smiled at her grandfather, appreciating his eagerness to contribute. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into the project, attending meetings with architects, discussing program designs, and helping create the shelter's mission statement. Her natural leadership abilities shone through as she articulated her vision clearly and passionately. Derek proved to be a valuable ally, using his business acumen to secure additional funding and support from influential community members. Sophie found herself growing closer to him as they worked together, his genuine commitment to the project helping to heal old wounds. As construction began, Sophie and Ethan stood outside the site, watching workers install the Maria's Haven sign. The elegant lettering caught the afternoon sun, making it glow warmly against the brick facade. "Mom would have loved this," Sophie said softly, gazing up at the sign. Ethan placed an arm around her shoulders and replied, "She'd be proud of both of us." The television studio buzzed with activity as makeup artists and producers rushed around, making final preparations. Sophie sat in the green room, her hand firmly gripping Ethan's. Despite her usual confidence, the prospect of sharing their story with millions of viewers made her stomach flutter with nerves. Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We're doing this for Mom, and for every woman who needs help," he said softly. Under the bright studio lights, the interview began. The host, a warm-voiced woman named Patricia Chen, guided them through their story with gentle questions. Ethan spoke first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I lost sight of what truly mattered," he admitted. "Success and reputation became everything, and I missed years with an amazing daughter who taught me the real meaning of strength and courage." Sophie watched her father speak, touched by his honesty. When it was her turn, she sat up straighter, channeling Maria's spirit. "My mom never gave up," Sophie said clearly. "Even when things were hardest, she kept going. That's why Maria's Haven is so important. It's a place where women can find the support my mom needed." The studio audience listened intently as Sophie described the shelter's mission. She spoke about education programs, job training, and most importantly, the sense of community that would help women rebuild their lives. Ethan added, "Sophie showed me that true success isn't measured in dollars or business deals. It's about the lives we touch and the positive changes we create." Social media exploded with support during the broadcast. Viewers praised Ethan's transformation from corporate titan to devoted father and philanthropist. Sophie's passion and maturity captured hearts, inspiring donations to pour in for Maria's Haven. At school the next day, Sophie's teachers and classmates approached her with newfound respect. Her English teacher even asked if she would speak to the class about social activism and making a difference in the community. As they left the studio after the interview, Sophie hugged Ethan tightly. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. Ethan smiled, filled with pride and love. "This is just the beginning," he replied, holding his daughter close. Outside the studio windows, the lights of Maria's Haven glowed warmly in the distance, a beacon of hope for those in need of a fresh start. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Ethan's garden as he and Sophie knelt in the freshly tilled soil. Their hands worked in tandem, carefully placing vibrant flowers, Maria's favorites, into neat rows. Sophie's laughter rang out as Ethan accidentally sprayed himself with the water hose. "Dad, you're supposed to water the flowers, not yourself," she teased, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Ethan couldn't help but smile, noticing how Sophie's determined focus mirrored Maria's. The way she meticulously arranged each plant, ensuring proper spacing and depth, reminded him of how Maria used to tend to her art supplies. Their days had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. In the kitchen, Sophie patiently guided Ethan through basic recipes, though his attempts often ended with takeout orders. Still, these moments of shared laughter over burnt toast and oversalted pasta brought them closer. During their weekend road trips, they visited the small coastal town where Maria had spent her summers. Sophie sat quietly on the beach, listening intently as Ethan shared stories of young Maria's dreams and adventures. These trips became their sacred time, away from the bustle of city life and work commitments. Evening board game tournaments filled their home with competitive spirit. Sophie's strategic mind, another trait inherited from Maria, often left Ethan wondering how she managed to win so consistently. During movie nights, she introduced him to her favorite films, explaining plots and characters with infectious enthusiasm. At Maria's Haven, Sophie's natural leadership abilities shone through. She organized activities for the residents' children, helped with homework sessions, and offered comfort to those struggling to adjust. Ethan watched with pride as she embodied Maria's compassionate spirit, touching lives just as her mother had done. "You have her way with people," Ethan told Sophie one evening as they drove home from the shelter. "That ability to make everyone feel heard and valued, that's pure Maria." Sophie smiled, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes I worry I'll forget things about her, but then I catch myself doing something, and I can feel her with me." As they planted the last of the flowers, Sophie sat back on her heels, admiring their handiwork. The garden bloomed with color, pink roses, purple irises, and yellow daisies creating a living tribute to Maria's memory. "Mom would have loved this," Sophie said softly, running her fingers along a rose petal. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She'd be so proud of you. I know I am." They moved to the porch, settling into comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Their shared contentment spoke volumes about how far they'd come, their bond strengthened by both joy and grief, love and remembrance. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filled the rows, their proud chatter creating a symphony of joy. In the front row, Ethan Caldwell sat tall, his eyes fixed on the stage where graduates filed into their seats. Beside him, carefully placed on an empty chair, stood a framed photograph of Maria, her warm smile seeming to radiate through the glass. Sophie emerged with her fellow graduates, her honors cord swaying gently as she walked. The gold of her valedictorian sash caught the light, matching the sparkle in her eyes. Ethan's heart swelled with pride as he watched his daughter take her place on stage. When the dean approached the podium to introduce the valedictorian, his voice carried through the hall with reverence. "It is my honor to present this year's valedictorian, Sophie Caldwell." Sophie stood gracefully, her steps measured as she approached the podium. Her fingers brushed the speech notes she'd prepared, but her eyes lifted to meet the audience with unwavering confidence. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. My journey started in hardship, with a mother who sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a better life. Maria Torres was the strongest person I've ever known. Her voice wavered slightly as she continued. She taught me that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time life knocks you down. When I lost her, I thought my world had ended. But through that loss, I found my father, a man who proved that it's never too late to open your heart and choose love over fear. Ethan felt tears rolling down his cheeks as Sophie spoke about their journey together, about the healing power of forgiveness, and about the strength found in second chances. The audience hung on every word, many wiping away their own tears. "My mother dreamed of seeing me graduate college," Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. "While she can't be here physically, I feel her spirit in every achievement, every obstacle overcome, and every dream realized." The audience rose to their feet as Sophie concluded her speech, their applause thunderous and heartfelt. Ethan stood among them, his chest tight with pride and love. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and congratulations, Ethan pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside lay a delicate silver bracelet, its surface gleaming with the engraved words, "For Maria's Dream." Sophie's eyes welled with tears as he fastened it around her wrist. She threw her arms around him, whispering, "We did it, Dad. Mom would be so proud." Ethan held her close, his voice thick with emotion as he replied, "She would, and so am I. You've made all our dreams come true." They walked away from the stage together, the sunlight streaming through the windows, catching the bracelet's engraving, making Maria's dream shine bright on Sophie's wrist. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.